Well, good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads. Today is episode 109. Can't believe it. Today, Friday, June 17th, 2022. And we love on this show doing our interviews and talking to all sorts of folks in the community. We also love doing one-on-one education, telling you how we see things about the process of product development in this wonderful ecosystem that we exist inside of. And this brings us to where we are today, which is during these dog days of summer that are coming up, we're going to be talking about the process of de-risking. Now, that's a term you may or may not be familiar with, but it's one that we think is really, really important to the process of bringing new medical technologies to the market and to users who can benefit from them. So we're going to spend a few weeks on this. And in week one, we're going to be talking how problems actually get solved. It's funny because the more we look at projects that go through our doors or that we see passing by or that we see in the community, it's amazing how many times people don't actually understand how real problems actually get solved day in and day out. And so we're going to establish that framework today. We're going to talk about that. We'll leave time for Q&A and your questions as always. Anywhere in the show that you want to ask them, feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom. Feel free to put it into the chat. We're always happy to field those questions as we go through. Just one item of news before we get there, and that's, as a reminder, every week, save the date for the Michigan Medical Device Summit, Tuesday, September 20th of this year in Kalamazoo. We're looking forward to being in person with you there. It should be a great event put together by MishBio, always has been. 2018 was a phenomenal year there, and then, of course, COVID came along and sort of shut things down, but we are looking forward to that event once again. So with that, it brings us to our new series, De-risking medical device development. And this is our first week. How problems actually get solved when you're part of a medtech development team. Our agenda for today, first of all, what is de-risking? This is a term you may not have heard too much about. It's not a commonly used term in this industry, but we believe it's a very important term that captures a whole series of concepts that really go together well and should be bubbled up to the surface. So we'll talk about what de-risking is. We'll tell you why it's a helpful mindset for the development process. What does it actually accomplish? Why think about it this way? Why not just think about it as some other term that you've heard thrown around? What stages of a project does de-risking apply to? Where can you apply this concept? Then we're going to give you a lesson from the woodshed. I'm going to tell you about a recent trip that I took and some lessons that we learned that apply to this concept of de-risking. It's okay, I should just mention nobody got hurt. You're all wondering, de-risking, woodsheds, large pieces of wood? No, just as a preview, everyone is fine. After that, we'll give you an introduction to GTD, or Getting Things Done. It's a conceptual framework for moving projects forward. It's been part of my work life for the last 20 years, and I think an unwritten part of how we've done things here at Into Being. And I want to bring this wonderful resource to you. We're not paid to endorse GTD, but I want to introduce its concepts to you because it's formed such a part of how we do our work. And one you may have heard of before if you've been any longtime listener of the show, and that's the Cynefin framework. Yet another one we don't have any relationship to, but we use these principles as we are de-risking projects, and we believe that between GTD and Cynefin, even before you get to the FDA, and principles like design controls, which we'll be talking about on the next session, we believe that these are philosophical underpinnings for how projects actually need to get executed. So we're going to unpack those, open them up. And then in future weeks, we're going to be talking about the design control process, how it serves as a vehicle for the de-risking process. We're also going to be talking about specific examples where we've seen de-risking needs to be applied or sometimes hasn't been applied, and how you can really enable product development to happen well and to happen quickly, to happen efficiently. Oh, look, The PowerPoint's going to go through it again. Well, should have de-risked that one. Let me ask this. Has this ever happened to you? Maybe you work as a part of a company or a company that you used to work for, and you went through some kind of a competitive bid process. You spent time evaluating partners to help you on a project that you were working on. Maybe it wasn't an outsource. Maybe it was something internally. You spent a lot of time thinking about the problem, structuring, how are we going to make this happen? Then you had the all-important and on everybody's radar project kickoff meeting. Oh, now we're making progress. Now the real things are happening. The project kickoff has occurred. And if some of you are smirking, I agree with you. Because we do the role assignments. We make sure everybody has a role on this very important project. And then months pass. Then the project is behind schedule. If you resonate at all with this, you are not alone. Everyone runs to milestones that they can see that are easy to have happen. Well, we shouldn't say easy to have happen. Sometimes it's hard to wrangle the cats for a project kickoff, am I right? But once you're there, even though you have the right people for the job, you have talented individuals, and they're all arranged and you think you have all the gaps plugged, things can stall out with amazing regularity. If you've experienced this, then this topic is for you. So let's ask this question. What is de-risking? Well, if we go to the Oxford English Dictionary, I don't know, does anyone still use that anymore? It's defined as to make something safer by reducing the possibility that something bad will happen and that money will be lost. Now, this is a widely used term actually in the financial sector. In the financial sector, de-risking is very popular, and it often means cutting off relationships with entities that you know are going to drag you down. But it's a term that actually has a lot of power in almost every industry, and specifically in the medtech industry. Now, one of two thoughts may have gone through your mind when I said de-risking and gave you this example. The first thought that may have gone through your mind is, well, that sounds like a good thing to apply to every single medtech development project I've ever been a part of, because what can often happen? Well, something bad can happen and money can be lost. Let's face it, these projects involve often millions of dollars and dozens of people, if not more. And the one thing that you just don't want to have happen is for this thing to crash and burn. You want to see it through to the end. You want to see this, as we've talked so many times with clinicians and entrepreneurs on this show, they want to see it used on people. They want to see their invention and their innovation used in a way that helps humanity. If there's one resounding echo we've heard over the months and years that we've been doing this show, why do people have this passion? Why are they willing to go back to the well and to be financiers of these projects? Why are they willing to go back to the well and be serial entrepreneurs? Why do they keep pushing this forward? The resounding echo has always been, we want to see these ideas used to help people. And so much gets invested and so much can be lost. We'd be crazy not to apply techniques that can make it more efficient and can reduce that risk. Okay, that's one thing that may have gone through your head. But I know some of you are thinking this. Some of you are thinking, de-risking, huh? Sounds like a traditional engineer. Just wants to make everything perfect. How much extra is this going to cost? What extra layers is this going to add? How is this going to make my life more complex, harder, slower, and slow my entire process down? I wouldn't blame you if you thought that, because that's often what happens when people try to bring scrutiny to processes that are complex and do have hidden dangers. Because there are points in projects when the right thing to do is to charge forward, to grit your teeth and just get it done and just move forward. So how do you know the difference? How do you know which is right? How do you know when it's time to apply de-risking principles and when it's time to just charge forward and get it done? That's what we'll be talking about today. And so here's the question. Is de-risking something that can be applied to a project? Or is it something that is infused into a project. You know the difference between that? I mean, here's applied. I'm applying force to a banana in this picture. It doesn't do much for the banana. It doesn't do much for my process. Just sort of squishes it. Here's a picture of a nice banana. I don't know if we're infusing flavor into the banana or if we're infusing a more nuanced technique, but we end up with a much more pleasing picture on the right side. But if we think about it, let's take yeast as an example. If I sprinkle yeast on top of mixed bread dough, the bread isn't going to rise. I'm going to have some sort of bitter tasting yeast on top of my hard cracker. You have to infuse yeast into bread dough to get the yeast to do anything. If I dip a vanilla bean in a jar of alcohol, I'm not going to get vanilla extract. I have to place it in there and let the vanilla bean infuse into the whole of that jar. And then I will have vanilla extract, something that's wonderful and can be used for all sorts of things. Concepts like de-risking are only active and useful if you infuse them into the thing that they're supposed to affect. This is how it is. You can't just apply de-risking. It's not a layer to be applied on top of everything else. It's something that has to be infused. And that actually has to be infused into your team. Edward Deming, some of you may know his name. He is known as the father of quality. And quality is related to these kinds of topics. When we talk about quality systems, we're talking about having things work well and having things work right. Edward Deming had 14 points for his total quality management process. And I'll wager that many people who have experienced quality systems would be shocked to know some of the things that Deming said, because they actually contradict most of how people think about quality today. We can apply some of these to the process of de-risking. His point number 2 was this: cease dependence on inspection to achieve quality. In other words, you can't inspect quality in. He was looking for an infused process whereby quality would be present in what you're working on together. Number 8 for him was drive out fear. Oftentimes, and we'll talk about this, de-risking doesn't happen because people are afraid. Afraid of what happens if I raise my voice, afraid of what happens if I say something. His number 9 was break down barriers between staff areas. In fact, he went so far as to say that if a quality department exists, we've failed at our job of quality. Tell that to every department, every company that has a quality department. His goal was to train every area of a company in what it means to produce quality product, such that this would happen organically. Part of his philosophy was to institute a vigorous program of education and self-improvement for everyone, and to put everybody in the company to work accomplishing the transformation. This relates dramatically well to what we're talking about here with de-risking. These same principles apply. De-risking is not something you apply to your product development effort. De-risking is something that you want to infuse into every member of your team, whether they're part of your immediate team or whether they're a third party working with you. You want this mentality that we're going to be talking about today. Here's the thing. Raw gumption is not enough. I mostly put that there because I wanted to use the word gumption in a PowerPoint. Now I've done that. But it's true. Goals are not enough. Are they necessary? Absolutely. Are they enough? Not remotely. Enthusiasm isn't enough. Is it necessary? Yes. If you've ever been around a group of people who don't have the enthusiasm to pursue what's been put in front of them, you know that enthusiasm is wildly necessary, but it's not sufficient. Funding, incredibly important. Incredibly important. We've had some wonderful times in the show, and we're going to have more coming up this year when we've talked to early stage funders, and later this year we'll be talking to venture capitalists about how they think about investing their hard-won funds into these kinds of projects. Is it necessary? Absolutely. Is it sufficient? Is it enough? No, because so many projects burn through and waste the funds they've been given because they can't adopt principles of de-risking. Even the right team isn't enough. Having all the right talent isn't enough. There's something that has to tie it together. There's a philosophy and a process that needs to tie it together, and that's what we're talking about. Well, let's talk about one more challenge. You ever heard these words? Be a team player. Well, that's actually a code word. And in today's environment, this is what that code word means. It means to be a yes man or a yes woman in today's environment. You should be a team player. Generally, most people hear that as sit down, keep your mouth closed, keep your hands in your lap, spoke when you're spoken to. I had somebody just the other day tell me that they worked at a place where they were told by upper management that we don't listen to the rank and file. Well, that's a recipe for disaster. We really need to redefine what the word team player means, because many of us, we survive by saying, well, I know what my job is, that's not my problem. Or, not my circus, not my monkeys. You ever heard that one before? But here's the difference. That kind of works for a factory floor, kind of, if you're producing the exact same thing day in and day out. But if you're doing truly innovative, novel work where you want to change the course of healthcare, this whole team has to move together as one. What is the concern of one member is the concern of others. In fact, I remember back to conversations we've had with many investors, and they'll often tell you one of the greatest things that they bring to the table isn't just the dollars. It's the connections. It's the expertise. It's the having seen this before, the ability to reflect on what you're up against and to talk about it with your team. So it's incredibly important. We need to tell people that they will not be shot down for sharing their ideas, but they need to raise concerns with solutions. This is a part of the de-risking process. We can encourage this through this kind of a mindset. And this mindset has to understand causality and consequences. Let's talk about that a little bit more. Let's do it by way of an example. Here's a first example to understand consequence and de-risking. Here's our friend Bob. And Bob is a designer. And Bob is sitting in a team meeting, and Bob says, well, I can't start the design until I have a complete requirements list for marketing. Now, we're not going to judge Bob's statement right now, but we're going to look at the types of responses to Bob's statement that we often see in companies. Here's scenario one, and this is a really bad one. So if you've ever seen this, run away. The team says to him, or management says to Bob, Bob, you're not a team player. Get moving. Well, this is just all around a bad response. Now, let me remind you, we don't know today whether Bob is lazy and just doesn't want to do his work, or whether Bob is seeing something really important and really vital and is maybe not asking as he should, but wishes somebody would recognize that there are dependencies, that there are consequences that other people aren't seeing. Let's look at another response to Bob's protestation. Bob says, I can't start the design until I have a complete requirements list from marketing. Well, here's a better response to Bob. Bob, try your best with what you have. And if things change, we'll rework it. We recognize that some of that work may have to be redone, but we just need you to move forward. That's a much better response because it puts Bob's heart at ease, saying, well, at least they understand that they're not going to get what they were hoping for. But I can move forward in good faith. I recognize I may have to redo some of this. It's still not the best place to be, but it is a better way of moving this forward. Scenario 3. He makes the same protestation. But the response is this. Hey, Bob, You know, you're right. The design is wholly dependent on the requirements, and they're not done yet. But we need to keep the ball rolling. Can you create, maybe you can't create the finished design. But Bob, can you create some conceptual designs? That way we can trial run some of the stable parts of the design. And that would allow us to focus the questions that are still there on the marketing department. We'll actually help them to help us if we can show them something and say, hey, here's the missing gaps. That means we need answers here. That's really the de-risking process starting to happen. The first two examples weren't really de-risking. They were just some basic human courtesy coming into view. But de-risking happens when empathy happens. When entities start to recognize each other's needs, to understand what the consequences of pushing forward are versus the consequences of finding some other bit of information. And so it's a really important concept coming into view. But this still isn't the best way to respond. There are better ways. And for this, we're going to strike out Bob's first statement because there's something that Bob can do in this interaction. Bob's not going to say, I can't start the design. Bob's going to be the one who pushes this forward. And so, just to catch your attention, we said this is even better, I think. What if Bob were to say, you know what? I've realized the design is wholly dependent on requirements that aren't done yet. But we need to keep the ball rolling. What if all your employees said that? I know we need to keep the ball rolling. Here's what we're going to do. If I start the detailed design now, we'll be throwing it away in a few months. But how about I create some conceptual designs that allow us to trial run stable parts of the design and that allow us to focus the questions for marketing? Wouldn't that be amazing? What is Bob doing? Bob isn't saying, not my circus, not my monkeys. Bob is realizing that all these parts are interconnected and that yes, it would be inappropriate to put an expectation on him to create a finished design. But here's what he can do from his seat to push that ball as far as it can. And that actually enables links to other parts of the process that aren't even the design process to be tickled, to be moved forward. And that he's actually helping to drive the project from his perspective. You know, teams that don't understand the interrelatedness of their domain, they're going to flounder. And making a project plan by itself is not going to solve this. Now, no one here is against project planning. It's actually really important. But the project plan by itself, it's not going to solve anything. It was Dwight Eisenhower who said, plans are worthless, but planning is everything. Well, depends on who you read. That's been attributed to a lot of people. But so here's the question. If plans never go according to plan, why bother to plan? How is that first plan of any use if it's just going to fall apart and not be real? Well, even the process of creating a static plan helps you, most of all, to understand the interrelations between causes and effects, between actions and consequences, between dependencies and their predecessors, between requirements and tests. How many times have we encountered something where, oh, we got to go do a test on this? Well, do we know what was the original requirement for this device? No. Well, guess what needs to happen next? It's not the test, it's the requirement. But planning doesn't even have to be only a high-level activity. There's a lot of value in sitting down as a team or as executive management and going through and laying out these kinds of plans. It is vitally important. But planning of the de-risking type can actually happen at the individual and small team level, just like we saw with Bob's example. Bob was able to get dependencies and predecessors in their right order through simple discussions around a single topic. It's not to throw the Gantt chart under the bus. They're necessary, they're important, because you do need a bird's eye view. But what about this type of de-risking? What about this type of process planning that emerges when people meet together and they say, we should do this next? And somebody says, well, we can't because of this, this, and this. The right answer isn't despair and to shut everything down. The right answer is to make sure that all of those predecessors and all of those dependencies are addressed. This is something that's very living, very active, something that needs to happen, and it needs to be part of your team's philosophy about how you move forward as a group. Negotiating those, moving those forward, it's incredibly, incredibly important. I love this. Of course, all sources of business wisdom come through XKCD, the cartoon. Thanks, Steve, for posting this one on our internal thing. I stole it and I'm using it today. The doctor looking at the patient says, I'm taking a look at your numbers and it doesn't look good. You have a lot of measurements, quite a few variables. And the patient says, is that bad? The doctor, variables are the #1 risk factor for outcomes. The past is a big contributor to the future. Isn't that just causality? Causality is the leading cause of death in this country. So what are my odds? Do you have a family history? Yes? Or of what? Just in general. Yes? Oh no. This is simply pointing to the fact that we are dealing with a lot of variables in life and in product development. And each one of those variables has the potential to derail things. You can't predict the future. You can't get everything right. You're going to encounter things midstream. How do you deal with them? Well, first, you better try to know what they are. That is really, really important. But as you encounter these, this process of de-risking them, understanding dependencies, understanding predecessors, is so incredibly important. I cannot overemphasize this. Here's another way to look at de-risking. Someday, you're going to be looking back at stories about this project that you're working on. Are they stories that you did or did not want to tell? You're going to look back, you're going to tell the stories. Are they stories that you did or didn't want to tell? As you encounter these kinds of dependencies, these kinds of realizations, you should expect the story to change. You're hoping that it changes in a good and a right direction for your project. But the goal is to make sure that you won't completely derail it if it changes in the wrong direction. De-risking is finding the consequences I can and can't live with. Eyes wide open to what they might be and at what junctures they might occur. It's so incredibly important. So to what stages does this philosophy apply? Well, at Into Being, we work in conceptual, functional prototype design. We work in prototypes and designs for clinical trials, first in human, all the way to commercialization, right? We're working on the designs, the prototyping, the early stage manufacturing, and the regulatory. In all of these areas, we've never found a stage where this doesn't apply. And of course, we all know that beyond that, it applies in the manufacturing and product commercialization stages. It applies at all these different levels. Which brings us to the lesson from the woodshed. A few weeks ago, some of my kids and I were volunteering out of state, and we were doing some work, and one of the things that we ended up doing was hauling some wood for a camp in the area. And our group spent about 2 hours hauling about 3 tons of wood. Well, it was backbreaking work and a little bit fun at the same time. It's always good to get out there and do stuff. Remember at the beginning of this, we started with the safety mindset? Well, you can be too safety oriented. You can be too worried about planning everything out. The other end of the spectrum is the get her done mindset. And that's important. That was important the other evening when we were hauling wood, when we hauled 3 tons of wood. It turns out that, in fact, it's very simple. If we'd had twice the people and an extra truck, we could have done that project about twice as fast. Or we could have hauled about twice as much wood in about the same time. There really are situations, and they come very frequently, where it's just time to roll up your sleeves and get the job done. And it's very important to recognize when that's there, because thinking about it at that point is just going to slow you down. Thinking about it and navel gazing is going to completely waste your time. There's a million parts to every project that are, in fact, hauling wood. Grab the people, throw them on the job, get it done. If you need to, get another truck. If you have to, buy another truck. Because there are times when throwing money and people at the problem will solve the problem. And I use the woodshed as an example. It's very addressable to simply throw resources at it, and it does help in that case. But not every project is a woodshed project. The classic example, 9 women can't make a baby in 1 month. But understanding which you're under is a big part of de-risking. Is this making a new human, or is this hauling wood? One of those yields to additional resources, the other doesn't. So understanding that is a big part of de-risking. The call for de-risking is not a call to think harder about everything, to waste more time, to spend more hours in project planning meetings. That is not what the call is for. It's a call to understand whether you really understand the problem you're addressing, whether you understand the predecessors, the dependencies, or whether you can just throw resources at it, because both of those situations we do encounter, and you have to understand which you're under. Well, I want to introduce you to this. This is a man by the name of David Allen. His work has definitely stood the test of time. Like I said at the beginning, it's been a part of my own working philosophy for the last 20 years. You can, if you scan that QR code there with your phone, you can go straight and buy the book from Amazon. We don't get any cut of that. This is there's no relationship here. But I want to do a little review of this because David Allen's approach to getting things done applies not only to projects like we're talking about in MedTech, but it applies to your personal life as well. And he's made some very key observations that, like we said, have stood the test of time, and I want to review with you. He's got 5 steps to getting things done. The first is to capture information that's coming your way, to write, record, gather everything that's coming to your attention in some kind of a collection tool. Now, in future weeks, we're going to talk about what are MedTech appropriate collection tools. And I'll tell you, the design control process is a big part of the system that you would use in a MedTech development project, right? What FDA's expectations are around design controls actually provide a system that you can implement that allows you to have a capture location, as well as an organization methodology. But right now, at this point, David Allen's talking to us about you've got to capture the information. You have to clarify. This is perhaps the most important step of his philosophy. You have to clarify, is this information actionable? Can you actually do something with it today? Or is it really just goals and things that are aspirational? You've got to clarify that. You have to organize these things. You've got to reflect upon them and to review them. This actually does correlate very well to the process of design controls, where design reviews have to occur later on in the process. Then you have to engage. You have to know that the information is categorized and aggregated in such a way that when you take action, it's decisive and you know that it's going to have pretty much the effect that you are looking at. This is a very, very important process, but I want to drill down to something even simpler that David Allen has observed. And that's this very simple but very profound distinction. David distinguishes between what are called next actions and what are called projects. Now, whether you're involved in a MedTech development project right now or not, listen to the following, because you can apply this to your own life today. It's that good. David says this: it might amaze you to discover how many next actions for how many projects and commitments remain undetermined by most people. Notice that he's distinguishing between a next action and a project. What could he mean by this, and why is it important that most people don't know the difference? Well, He goes on to say this: it's extremely difficult to manage actions you haven't identified or decided on. Most people have dozens of things that they need to do to make progress on many fronts, but they don't yet know what they are. Well, that seems a little unfair, David. We were in a meeting the other day and we made a to-do list, an action item list at the end of the meeting. Well, that's great. But do you know those items are actionable? Do you know your team can actually do them? I didn't say whether your team was qualified. I didn't say whether they were smart. I didn't say whether they were in the office. I said, do you know that they are actionable items? And the common complaint is, I don't have time to do whatever it is, David continues. It's understandable because many projects seem overwhelming, and they are overwhelming. And here's the kicker: because you can't do a project at all. You can only do an action related to it. If you carry nothing else away from today's session, it's this one line. And it's kind of scandalous in the way that he phrases it. You can't do projects at all. Full stop. You can only do an action related to it. This really brings us to the understanding that a goal or a project is not an action. It's an aspiration. Like we said before, is it necessary? Absolutely. A project without a goal or a project at all is absolutely useless unless you understand what you're going for and why you're going for it. But a project by itself, even a goal by itself, isn't the next action that you need to take to make that project happen. That's why this clarify step is so incredibly important in the getting things done philosophy. You have to understand whether the things you're asking of yourself or of your team are actually actionable. Can this be done now? Far too many projects assign, quote, tasks that actually can't be done. And if you start to look, you'll see that this is true. Here are some examples from your own life. We'll talk in future weeks about how these apply to medtech projects. What if you want to build a deck? It's a project, right? What if you want to paint the bedroom? It's a project. What if you want to make dinner? It's actually a project. Here's the build a deck one as actions. You might start out by exploring conceptual and aesthetic designs on Pinterest or your favorite place to look at decks. You need to find, make, or hire blueprints to be made, because you're going to need to submit those to get a permit. But now enters some of the complexity, because there's a good enough chance that something will be wrong, that those permits will be rejected. You'll have to go back to the drawing board. Then you can reapply for the permit. Then it's time to hire a backhoe, a post hole digger, get to work. Oh, but we got to wait for a sunny day. There's some dependencies there. Then we can clear the land. Then we can dig the post holes. The list goes on and on and on. That's why we let it run off the bottom of the page. This very simple idea of build a deck is actually made up. It comprises many, many different elements, some of which have uncertainty associated with them. Some of them have some pretty big dependencies. And for all those of us who struggle to get projects done at home, this is part of why. Have we identified the next action that's immediately addressable that we can do so that we know that this thing is moving forward? Here's paint the bedroom in action form. Got to explore the color schemes. Got to go get paint samples. At least we're smart enough now to know that we should get paint samples rather than buying a whole gallon of paint. We need brushes and other things. Then we need to decide where to store the furniture in the room while we're painting all the walls. This probably leads to another realization that we're going to need to negotiate with family members that they're okay with all that stuff being stored in the living room while the office is being painted. Then we remove the furniture from the room. and we wash the walls, and we patch the drywall holes. Well, do we, or did we forget to buy the spackling at the hardware store? See how many actions are involved in something that looks like a simple to-do? And if these involve different people, different dependencies, the complexity, even for a home project, spirals pretty quickly. Try the samples. I don't know if it's just me, but that always comes out too dark. You got to go back to the store for lighter samples. And then you got to remove the baseboards, which you forgot to do and hopefully didn't spill paint on. We're just painting this to give you an idea of the complexity involved in everyday projects, not even tasks. These are projects, things that seem simple to us. Make dinner, you explore the recipes. You mentally anticipate what's in the pantry. You make your shopping lists. You go to the store after work to buy the missing items. You get home and you unload. You discover that you have no pasta. Then you remove the TV dinner from the freezer. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. But the point is, or the way to boil this down, people will realize, and we'll talk about this more in coming weeks, in medtech projects, they'll realize that they need, for example, they need a design, and they'll see it as a single step, not as a project. People will see biocomp testing, their need for biocomp testing, and they'll see it as a single step. They won't see it as a project. They'll see that they need to go talk to FDA, and they'll see it as a single step, not as a series of dependencies, all of which involve decisions, all of which can de-risk, streamline, and make their process more efficient. And many times, shame on them, their partners will not make those choices clear. One of the most valuable things you can do as a part of a team is to make the choices, the consequences, the dependencies clear to those who are your stakeholders. It's not so much that there's always a single right answer, but to know where the levers are, to share where the levers are, so that the people who have the responsibility to pull them can know what's likely to happen to the train when they pull that lever is really, really important. And that's a big part of the de-risking process. Some commonalities among the pedantic examples that we just shared. It's this progression from a conceptual idea to a refined idea. And often, there's way more steps and iterations than at first glance. Recognizing this and identifying those change points and those decision points is a big part of de-risking. But before we're done, let's give you one more framework. And that is called the Cynefin framework. This was conceived by David Snowden in 1999 while he was working at IBM. I like Wikipedia's summary of his thought process. The idea of the Cynefin framework is that it offers decision makers a sense of place from which to view their perceptions. Cynefin is a Welsh word that has to do with that idea of sense of place. This idea of, do you actually know where you're standing? You have perceptions in your own mind. And think about this from a project perspective. You have perceptions in your own mind, but do you actually know where you're standing? That's really, really important, because how you perceive what needs to happen next depends greatly, I think we're quoting Ben Kenobi at this point, on your point of view. Where are you standing? And if you could have some self-awareness of where you're standing, it would allow you to de-risk what the next steps are. And a step that you thought was really appropriate might not be. Or a step that you never would have considered, maybe as being too hard or maybe as being beyond thinking that it could be that easy, might be right at your fingertips. And so this process of sense-making is a really important contribution to the world of problem solving. We're going to show you some pictures here, and we just got an attaboy for GTD. The waiting for tab is a little too long. Yes, as you get into GTD, it's got all sorts of wonderful examples of how to break up your work, and some good stuff, some that people find they can't implement all the details of, but it's worth a read either way. It's a huge thing. But back on Cynefin, here's what the Cynefin framework kind of looks like. We've got 4 domains, and we've talked about these on the show before, This is a graphic made by Martin Berg. His website is vige.se, vige.se. If you scan that code to the left, you can go right to his graphics that he uses to help explain this process. On the previous slides, if you're watching this in reruns, you can scan that previous one to go to the Cynefin company that Snowden started. And there's 4 domains. There's the clear domain, and that's at the top of the mountain. It's where we all want to be, and unfortunately, where we often assume we are. The clear domain. Beneath that is the complicated domain. Beneath that, the complex domain. You can see the graphics getting a little more and more squirrely as we go down that hill. And near a large pit called confused, and over a little hump, there's the chaotic domain. Now, as you might imagine, the chaotic domain is not a place where we want to be playing if we are in the world of bringing new medical technologies to market. It's a place to recognize and to stay away from. Because to get over that hump between the chaotic and the complex domains, it often requires guesses. And if we can full screen this so we can see the details, there are some really big questions that you have to ask to make your way over this part of the domain. We're going to zoom in here. You're basically blindfolded. You're guessing. There be animals shooting fire at your tail in the chaotic domain. We've got to take a guess, and we've got to hope that that guess gets us over the wall. That is not a place you want to be playing with investor dollars. That is not a place you want to be playing with people's careers unless they're invested in that kind of wildly early stage research where you simply have to guess. But then we get over to the complex domain. There are pathways. There are ideas that can be followed. There are hints that this might be a good path to look down. Then comes the eureka moment. Now, we would, at some level, like this to not be part of the world of startups. But the reality is that it is. Patents come out of the complex domain. You have to have an inventive step to get a patent. That's that eureka moment. That's a very important step to have happen. So as much as we'd like to not spend time in the complex domain, in every medtech project, we're usually spending some of our time in the complex domain. That's where the real innovation comes from. That's where the real inventions come from. And those eureka moments are not a bad thing at all. But then we make our way up to the complicated domain. We've climbed a big ladder, and it's from the complicated domain that we start to achieve clarity. We can create recipes for how things should be done. In the world of design and development, often these come in the form of work instructions, of engineering drawings, and things like that. There's things that we can teach ourselves that can be repeated over and over and over again that brings us to the clear domain. Of course, when something goes a little bit wrong, we often fall momentarily back into the chaotic domain and have to try a few things to find out where we are so that we can retrace our steps. But this framework is really important in starting to ask the questions of where are we? Is a next action readily available to us? Or is it something that's going to require some experimentation, some possible dead ends on our way to the right answer? For a team to be united on their understanding of which domain they're in is incredibly important for clarity and moving forward. Transparency is important. In recent years, we've been noticing that transparency among teams has been going up, and we think that's a wonderful thing. But transparency with clarity as to which domain you find yourself in, and whether next actions are available, and whether those next actions are going to result in definitive motion forward, or whether the next action could result simply in knowing that you barked up the wrong tree and having to back up a little bit. If you know that's coming, it's much more palatable than if you don't. Let's look at one more slide from the Cynefin framework. just to dive in here on these 4 domains. The clear domain allows you to implement what we would call best practices, which is great. It's great when there's a recipe. I love it. We're back in the woodshed. We can haul those logs. You know, when we were hauling those logs the other day, we came upon a pile of logs that was out near where they had been cut. There was a whole bunch of branches that whoever cut it had dumped right in front of the pile of logs. This meant that we had to carry logs all the way around the pile of branches. Well, then we realized that there was a tractor available with some pitchfork tines on it. So somebody ran and grabbed that, lifted them up, and hauled them out of the way. We're still in the domain of best practices here. Yeah, there's a problem. We know exactly how to solve it. We're going to do it. But if we had to ask, will the pitchfork tines on the tractor really lift the brush? We wouldn't be in the domain of clear anymore. We'd be in something that's complicated or complex. And that's often how it is with these types of development projects. Good practices or exhibitive practices are the domain of complicated and complex. They usually respond to needing to try something, to see the response to that thing that you just tried, and then to make a decision. But this ties into the idea of a lean or a fail-fast mentality. This is where fail-fast rubber meets the road. It doesn't just meet the road at the idea of, oh, I tried a startup and the startup didn't work and now I'm on to my next startup. That's not the idea. Fail fast needs to happen at this level that Knevin is talking about. It needs to happen at the level of next actions. In other words, we see a problem ahead of us and we probe it and we find out, is that going to yield to what we thought it was going to yield to? If it doesn't, we haven't wasted much time. If it does, we're sure, we pour the resources on, we haul the wood, we get 2 teams, and we do those 3 tons in 1 hour instead of 2 hours. You see how these techniques all sort of go together in the types of projects that we're all used to dealing with on a daily basis at home? This is how these techniques can go together to help us understand the process of de-risking. So today we talked about an introduction to the de-risking mindset. It's infused, it's not applied. You don't slam it on top of a team and say, here's 10 new procedures for you to follow. You have to infuse this into people's mentality. You have to empower them, make them not afraid to bring not only problems but also solutions. Dependencies can be scary. If you see that things are related to each other, it can be scary. You need to not get lost in that complexity, but to quickly understand paths through it. It needs to be complexity aware. On the next session in 2 weeks, next week we have the Women Who Innovate second installment with our friends from MEDC and women from around the state, so we're looking forward to that. But in our next session on de-risking medical device development, we'll be talking about design controls as a vehicle for de-risking. We've talked about some of the general principles, but how can you implement these as a part of the design control process? That's what we'll be talking about next week. I want to give a shout out to unsplash.com. They say attribution is appreciated, and many of the images we used in today's presentation are from unsplash.com. If you scan any of those QR codes, you could get to those images. Really cool place where photographers and others will show their wares for free. You can use them for commercial purposes. They like attribution, and we think that's worth shouting out to. So with that, we will start to bring this session to a close. We'll see if anyone has any questions or comments about the process of de-risking. We have just a couple minutes left. We'd love to field your questions or your comments. If anything that we said today resonates with you, share your stories. We'd love to hear them. If any questions about how we've phrased this or things you'd like to see us address in an upcoming show, we'd love to take those as well. So feel free to reach out here in the remaining seconds. Again, a reminder that next week, the second installment of Women Who Innovate in partnership with the Michigan Economic Development Corporation. We're looking forward greatly to that. And since I'm not seeing any questions, I want to thank you all for being here today. It's always fun as usual. Next time 2 weeks from now, we'll be talking about design controls and how they enter the de-risking process. Thanks for being with us on MedTech Crossroads. Have a great night. Bye-bye.